You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, I'm Chris Coyne, the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And today I am joined by Professor Abigail Hall, who is an Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Tampa. Abby, welcome back to the Hayek Program podcast, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, always a pleasure.
All right, so today we are talking about your paper In Search of Stable Peace, which is published in Markets and Society, the journal that the Hayek Program publishes. This is appeared in Volume 1, Issue 2 in 2025. And the volume itself is a symposium exploring different aspects of peace. And we organized it around different thinkers. One of them is Kenneth Boulding. And your paper in that symposium is built around and focuses on Kenneth Boulding's book, Stable Peace. That's the title of it, which listeners can tell why you named your paper what you did. But just to provide a little bit of background, Boulding published this book in 1978. He would have, at this point, been out in Colorado, but he took a year leave of absence during the 1976 1977 academic year and was a visiting professor at the University of Texas in Austin at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. And while he was there, he gave a series of public talks in addition to seminar discussions. And he collected those talks and seminar discussions into a volume at the end of that visiting professorship. And that's what became Stable Peace. And so, what I hope that we can get at in our discussion today is I want listeners to walk away with a sense of some of the key themes of the book, but also I want to engage your paper because one of the things I really appreciate it is not only does it kind of highlight those core themes, but also highlight some tensions and also some areas for future inquiry and scholarship. And so while I do want to be backward looking from the perspective of highlighting Boulding's key kind of conceptual and practical insights, I also hope that we can be forward looking too and think about some paths forward. And so let me start with a general question, but one that will get us going here, which is tell listeners what the core thesis of your paper is and how it relates to Boulding's Stable Peace.
So, the core thesis of the paper is really looking to understand this framework regarding stable peace that Boulding articulates in a variety of places, but I think lays out in a really user friendly way in Stable Peace. So, as you mentioned the book earlier, the book's relatively short. I think it's pretty digestible, even for people who do not have a background in issues related to war or defense or economics. And so, the purpose of the paper is really to understand or to kind of re-articulate these ideas that are laid out in Boulding because I don't think that it has been engaged, but I don't think it's been sufficiently engaged. But then also, as you mentioned, to highlight maybe some of the things that I find problematic about what Boulding lays out in the paper, but then also to hopefully encourage people to take these ideas and this framework seriously because I think it does have a lot of potential to inform contemporary research.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we'll unpack each of those different aspects as we go along in a little more detail. But before turning to that, I want to ask you to say a few words about the concept of peace itself. And peace studies scholars have made this distinction, which Balding talks about early on in his book, between negative and positive peace. And there's I don't know if it's a big debate, but there's certainly a discussion and debate about what aspects of peace matter, how we conceptualize it. And of course that matters not just in a purely academic way, but because it matters for how we perceive and observe peace and violence in the world. And then that can then inform both analytical but also policy discussions. And so, can you speak a little bit about the distinction between negative and positive peace, and any insights that you think Bowling had, or any of your own insights on the on that question?
Sure. So Boulding is considered to be one of the kind of fathers or founders of peace studies along with Galtung. And he and Galtung have very different ideas of how we should conceptualize peace. So as mentioned, first of these is a negative conceptualization of peace. So peace is an absence of something. So we'd think about peace as an absence of war in this case, which is the definition that Boulding employs. Now, on the other side of that coin, you have a positive definition of peace, which implies or which requires the presence of something. So then here we have a bunch of different questions about, well, what is it the presence of? Is it a presence of harmony? Is it a presence of this variable or that variable? And I think that this analytical distinction, as you mentioned, is important because it really does change the way that we conceptualize peace. So, a good example of that would be take the historical or contemporary dynamics between North and South Korea since the ceasefire agreement. Under that negative definition of peace, we would say that North and South Korea are at peace. However, with that positive definition, that becomes a much more difficult kind of thing to sell. So, one of the things that people have criticized Bolding for is exactly that, that those dynamics between North and South Korea or historical dynamics, say, between Israel and Iran, would be considered quote unquote peaceful. But for many people, that doesn't quite fit the bill, we could say, for peace. And so it is an important definition. It is a, to my understanding, continued ongoing discussion within this literature. But Bolding specifically utilizes this negative conceptualization of peace.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And just as a point of clarification for listeners who may not be familiar, when you said Galtung, it's Johan Galtung, who was a Norwegian sociologist. Abby mentioned that Balding was one of kind of the considered one of the founding fathers of peace and conflict economics. Galtung is also considered one of the founders of peace and conflict studies. For any listeners who have heard of the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, Galtung was the main founder of that and also one of the founders of the Journal of Peace Research. And of course, Balding was one of the founders of the Journal of Conflict Resolution. And so they coexisted at the same time, developing and debating these concepts. And you highlight a great point because you're certainly right that people point out, well, look, if you just focus on the negative aspects of peace. So meaning the absence of something, the absence of violence, you miss these other tensions and whatnot. But of course, one response to that is that when you focus too much on the positive side, it can become all encompassing. And so I forget where it is exactly, but I remember in one of the back and forths between Bolding and Galting, he says something like positive peace is whatever Johan wants it to be, because Galton had this enormous list of things that were positive peace, and it included things like social justice, the environment, all the like an enormous list that was like almost all encompassing. And Bowling was being tongue in cheek. They were very friendly, to my understanding, but at the same time, there is something to that.
Yes, and I'm familiar with that quote, and I the jabs between the 2 of them, which as you highlight are friendly, are particularly fun to read, but that exactly in my mind is kind of the big complication with these positive definitions of peace, is that then you can get to a point where, okay, if the negative definition maybe excludes things which we would not be considering, generally speaking, peaceful, you can define away any semblance of peace very, very easily if you start including, as you mentioned, conceptualizations of social justice or education or other things. As you mentioned, Galtung has a pretty comprehensive list.
Yeah, I mean, all of a sudden, income inequality, pollution, all these things become a form of violence or some attack on peace, which perhaps they are under certain conceptualizations, but you can see how it can get very broad very quickly, for better or for worse. So as we move through the book, this is we're still in the equivalent of chapter one of the book, where he's talking about the meaning of peace. He then turns to his conceptual framework, and one of the things that Balding does when he talks about war and peace is he talks about the war peace system, and then he introduces this. schematic with phases, what he calls phases of peace and violence. And there's 4 phases he talks about. And I wanted to ask you, and you're somewhat of a disadvantage because he has a visual in the book, which makes it easier to understand, but to the best of your ability, and I've heard you do this before, so I'm confident asking you, can you explain for our listeners how he conceptualizes the war peace system in light of these various phases?
Sure. So we can think about peace and war as having a couple of different kind of components or variables that influence where we are in terms of kind of this peace war. I think you could use the word spectrum if we're going on this in an audio format. And so he identifies kind of two broad categories of variables, one that he calls strength and then one that he calls strain. So, strain is this larger variable that can include things like images of the past, political systems, number of individuals in minority groups in a particular country. Basically, things that test or could push us into conflict. So, could push us into war. Now, strength is interesting because it's defined in relationship to strain. So, strength is essentially those things which allow us to effectively resist those strains on this peace war system. So, those things that keep us peaceful even when we have conflict within the system. And so, within this spectrum, Bolding articulates kind of four different categories in which we might find ourselves. So I'll start with the peace side. So one is stable peace, where you have two parties who are in a peaceful kind of coexisting relationship. And the idea of conflict does not enter into the equation. So, the examples that he uses in the book would be things like the historical and contemporary relationships between the US and Canada, or between, say, the United States and the United Kingdom. Can't imagine really a scenario in which probably the US and the United Kingdom are going to war with each other. The second category of peace, what he calls unstable peace. So you have actors who are not actively engaged in war, but war is within the realm of possibility, it's within the choice set. In a similar way, then you could move over into the war side, where you have what's called unstable war. So actors which are engaged in conflict, but there is the possibility for peace. So peace is within the relevant choice set. And then, kind of at the other far end of the spectrum, you have what's referred to as stable war, where you have two entities who are actively engaged in war, and there is not really a consideration for peace on the table. And so that's really what he identifies. And then he has, as you mentioned, this visual, which he uses to kind of explain when you have these different levels of strength and strain, these kind of movements between these different phases between war and peace.
All right, so this is great. That's a great description. Thank you. So I want to just highlight because you put it quite well, but I don't want it to be lost on anyone. This really important distinction, but also interrelation he makes between strength and strain. And I just wanted to mention a couple points, and then if you have any reactions or anything else you want to say, please do. Which is that, as you put it, for Bolding, strength and strain are conceptually different, but they interact to form the resiliency of the system. And strength are factors that place stress on the system. Strength is not military might. So he doesn't mean like military strength. He means the ability of the system to withstand strain. This is the point you were saying about them being related. So if I remember correctly, it's either in this book or elsewhere, the example he uses, the metaphor to illustrate this is a bridge with cars going over it. And he says the weight of the cars on the bridge, and at any point in time, there can be more or less cars or trucks or whatever vehicle on the bridge. They're strain. They're placing strain on the bridge. The strength of the bridge is the resiliency of the bridge to do what it's supposed to do, to hold up, if you will, under the strain of the vehicles on it without it breaking. And he then takes that kind of logic and applies it to a variety of different factors that place strain on it. As you put it, it's a combination of past images, current policies, and so on. Things that place pressure on the system, but then we have to think about whether the system can withstand it or not. Does that align with how you think about it, or any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that comports really well with the way that I think about it. And so it's interesting then because we can think about different combinations of okay, you can have potentially a lot of strain on a system, but if that system is very strong, then you wouldn't necessarily anticipate warlike activity. If on the other hand, you have a relatively small amount of strain, but the strength is relatively weak, then you could similarly see active conflict for seemingly kind of minor instances of strain. And so I think it's a really helpful again, I can see why for some people it's not the easiest thing to pick up and use analytically because the variables themselves can be a little fuzzy in terms of their definition and then as we'll probably get into the distinction between those categories that I just mentioned is not always abundantly clear, but I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense to think about those 2 variables as relating to each other, and I think that historically, we can see that they very much are related.
Yeah, thank you for that. And like you mentioned, we'll return to some of this in just a few moments. Before we move off the topic of this phase approach, I wanted to ask you from a conceptual and analytical standpoint, and you got at some of this a moment ago in your follow up comment about the usefulness of it analytically, but to sharpen our understanding of the phase approach, let's contrast it with kind of a static approach where a society is either violent or not violent, at war or not at war. How do you see Balding's phase approach offering us something analytically and empirically that perhaps more standard static approach misses?
Yeah, so I think that this is it's certainly a more dynamic way to think about when we're in conflict, when we're out of conflict, and again, kind of these not intermediate stages, but these distinct stages of, unstable peace, unstable war. And so one of the things that I really like about this framework is I think it allows for different methodological approaches for studying war and peace. I think potentially overlapping simultaneously. It also, for those of us who are economists, and Bowling too was an economist, allows us to think about and analyze in you are utilizing the economic way of thinking topics where are more kind of contemporary or more quote unquote typical tool sets. So, say like statistical analysis might not be workable. So, when we're talking about, say, a country getting into war with another country, or in a paper with some co-authors, we look at this framework within the context of civil war. I think you can apply this framework in those types of cases where the study is incredibly important, but our statistical tools would not be appropriate to utilize within those contexts. And so that's one of the things about this framework that I really like is it allows for some different types of explorations, and I think can shed some light in some areas that maybe otherwise might be kept in the dark.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And just to build on your excellent response, especially since we're on the Hayek program podcast, Balding doesn't invoke Hayek or the Austrians at all in this book. But every time I read through this, I certainly see some parallels between the way he talks about things and the way those from the Austrian tradition talk about things in general. He's talking about war and peace, of course. One of them is this idea of process. And so, another way to think about phases is as a process. You can move between them. You can remain in one category. You laid out the phases for us earlier, but there's the potential for constant movement between them, and that can go from violence to peace, or peace to violence, or stable peace or stable violence to unstable peace or violence. The other thing, though, kind of connection I see, and there's more too that we'll come back to later, but another one I see for now is that Balding has a deep appreciation for the complexities of the world. And so he is always careful, or mostly careful. I guess I shouldn't say always, but he's mostly careful, certainly not to overstate what he can say, but also to identify the limitations on what we can say. And so In the preface of the book, this is on page 11 of the preface. This is Balding speaking. He's summarizing what he's about to say in the book about the conflict peace system, these phases we're talking about. And he says prediction in systems of this kind is extremely difficult because of the strong importance of random factors and of undetectable discontinuities. Okay, and he continues on, but it resonates with me when he says that very much, as Hayek often pointed out with economic policy, economic systems, macroeconomics, how difficult it is to be able to make specific point predictions. And instead, oftentimes, we have to resort to broad pattern predictions. And in some sense, I see Balding indicating the same kind of thing with these categorical distinctions of the nature of peace and war through time, the process approach, but also the interaction effects between these categories of strength and strain, but also the fact that there's just some stuff we can't know. So it's true you give up some analytical tightness by broadening your conception of these things, but it perhaps gives you some insight into the actual world too.
The other thing that I would say, and in that paper that I mentioned, which is called Unstable Peace in El Salvador with my co-authors Nathan Goodman and Carlos Segovia. And one of the things that we highlight in that paper, which directly links this to the Austrian tradition, is that this framework it recognizes the critical importance of subjectivity. So one of the things that you'll notice in both the strength and the strain categories, that one of the things that Boulding points out is that people's feelings and their thoughts about the past are critically important. And so the lenses through which people are interpreting historical events as well as contemporary ones is really important in defining and in how people react to both strain variables, but also has the potential to increase or decrease strength as well. And so I think there are certainly a lot of parallels between what bowling is talking about and the Austrian tradition, even if, as you mentioned, it's not necessarily explicit in bowling.
Yeah, and that's great. Thank you for that. And I should mention for listeners, on a different episode, I'll be speaking with Abby's co-authors Nathan and Carla about that other paper, and so you will have the opportunity to hear more about that as well. And I appreciate you drawing that connection because, in some sense, these conversations all float together in a broad sense. So I appreciate that. Next thing I want to ask you, I want to continue with Boulding's framework here. So we've talked about the phases. Another really important concept that he introduces in Stable Peace, you talk about it in your paper in Markets and Society as well, is this idea of the taboo line and this idea of the transition between peace and war in the phase type of schematic being directly tied to this idea of the taboo line. And so can I ask you to say a little bit about what that taboo line is for Boulding and then how it relates to what you were talking about a few moments ago in terms of these different categories of stable or unstable peace and violence?
So, very simply, the taboo line for bowling is what separates activities from being considered acceptable and unacceptable. So, I think the example that I use in the paper is something like if I've asked my husband to unload the dishwasher 2 or 3 times and he hasn't done so, there are a lot of different choices that I could make about how to respond to that. I could ask him again. I could do it myself. I could talk to him about it. I could also stab him with an unwashed fork. But that last one is taboo. Like, I'm not going to cross that line that's considered to be wholly unacceptable. And so, when we're talking about the context of war and peace, this taboo line, he talks about it shifting. And so, when we're within the context of war, like things that otherwise would be considered wholly unacceptable, say things like destroying people's property, destroying people, other human beings, goes from being in the wholly unacceptable category to being considered acceptable. And in the context of war, that's what you do, right? And so, talking about this shift in the taboo line as being important and talking about our movement between these phases, especially those shifts between war and peace.
That's a great example. I'm glad that the stable peace persists and dominates in the Hall Blanco household. Although the kids maybe, I don't know, maybe they're not always.
No, as far as I know, no one has been stabbed with kitchen utensils, at least not intentionally.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you for that description and clarification what the taboo line is, because it matters a great deal for Balding here and in his other work. Because the other thing I just want to highlight, linking back to a point you raised earlier, is when you're talking about strain and strength, you're talking about how people perceive themselves, but also themselves in relation to others, because that's going to influence strength or strain, that aspect of the system. But the taboo line feeds directly into that because, as you put it, the taboo line informs us, if you will, or perhaps reflects as it doesn't really inform, reflects is a better word. It reflects what is viewed as acceptable or unacceptable, which is tied up in how you view other people and your relationships with them. I wanted to turn now to your paper. And your paper, you discuss how there are three key themes in the broader scholarship that references stable peace, and that is understanding peace and alternatives to war, deterrence theory as it pertains to nuclear weapons, and the concept of stable peace itself. And so, can you summarize as briefly as you can? I realize each of those is a very big topic in and of itself, but can you say a few words about each and how it relates to both your paper but also Bolding's book?
Sure. So in that first one of peace as an alternative to war, this is just thinking about what are kind of some alternative types of systems that might be implemented or that we could look at in terms of figuring out how we either move from that war side of this spectrum toward that peace side of the spectrum. So I think that's probably maybe as fast as I could go through that one. A second kind of theme that you mentioned is just looking at the stable peace literature itself. So one of the questions that we have, and one of the things that I think is really interesting, is those earlier examples that I used of the US and Canada and the US and the UK as being in these stable peace relationships, which are both from Bolding's work, were not always stable peace relationships. And so you had a militarized border between the US and Canada. You had two wars between the US and the United Kingdom. And so, how do we move from one phase to another phase? And so, there's that concept itself, which I think is interesting. But then also, I guess I'm kind of combining these last two here, is not only kind of studying the stable peace relationship in and of itself, but then also studying those movements towards stable peace. So when we see them, how do we get there, and then how do we really kind of crystallize these? Because the goal for Bolding and for Galtung, and then for I think a lot of us who are in this literature, is how do we get into these stable peace relationships and maintain them?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we'll come back to that in a moment because I'm going to ask you about future directions for research. And I think what you've just touched upon is central to that, but certainly not the only potential path. I do want to ask you about some of the tensions that you identify in the paper within Bolding. And we've touched upon one of them right from the get-go, the negative positive peace distinction. And if there's anything else you want to say about that, of course we can. But I want to ask you about another aspect of attention, which I think is a very important one, and I'm glad you highlight in your paper, which is that Balding, when he moves later in the book to discuss, there's a chapter called "Policy for Peace," where he gets a little more concrete in terms of policy prescriptions, although still broad. He oftentimes invokes what we might think of it as top-down government solutions. So he talks about, creating a Department of Peace. He talks about the United Nations. And so you discuss this in your paper and highlight a tension with this set of suggestions in light of the earlier analysis in the book. And so can you talk a little bit about the tension in Balding and what you see as being at the root of that tension?
Yes. So bolding in the beginning of Stable Peace and elsewhere makes it very, very clear that governments make war. And so he's very clear about this, that it is governments and actors within government who are making war. And so the fundamental tension then is that in this latter part of the book, as you mentioned, the solutions that Bolding offers for trying to again move us into this direction of stable peace are government based. And so you mentioned that he speaks a lot about the UN. He talks about developing this Department of Peace, which he frames as kind of the sister to the Department of War, which I guess is now the right name again. But then also talks about things like utilizing surveillance as a means of maintaining peace and keeping peaceful relationships. And so I think that it is inherently contradictory. I don't think is too strong to say, hey, government is the problem, and yet these exact same institutional structures that are generating these issues that I'm identifying are the same types of institutional structures that I wish to rely on to fix the problem. I think is a serious tension in Bolding, and one where if I had the chance to talk to Bolding would definitely be on the top, or it would be near the top of the questions list of what's going on here? Because to me, I found it actually to be a bit jarring in reading it, where you have just such a clear identification of where so many of these issues are coming from, and then this simultaneous desire to rely on the state to fix itself. And I think from an Austrian perspective, there's a variety of epistemological issues that we could point to as being problematic with this approach. From the public choice literature, you start to understand the political pathologies in democratic and other societies, which I think also would make this type of solution that Bolding proposes extremely difficult, if not practically impossible to implement or be successful.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is interesting because, of course, it all depends on how one reads into this. But when you read the earlier part of the book, one thing I always take away from it is that there's no one size fits all. As you mentioned earlier when you were talking about your other paper on El Salvador, the framework that he offers us for understanding different phases of war and peace can apply to a whole host of different environments. But the minute you recognize that, you realize that no two environments are the same. So there's no one size fits all for understanding. There's a framework, but there's no single explanation for war or peace. There's also no single solution to get peace or to get rid of war. It seems like there would need to be a diverse, almost polycentric type setup where you had a variety of different competing smaller units and people interacting and then interactions across those units in all interesting and creative ways. That then opens the door for us to turn to the last section of your paper, sections, I should say, because I think the last two is when you discuss this, if I remember correctly. You talk about extensions of stable peace. And I want to start by asking you about one of the extensions you highlight, which is the study of ideology. And you talk about ideology as it relates to things like being more or less warlike. And I want to ask you to give listeners a sense of what you mean by ideology, how it relates to war and peace, and how you think there are opportunities based on that for further scholarship.
Sure. So there are a lot of different definitions of ideology. So the best example I have of this is if you ask 15 people to define ideology, you're going to get 15 different answers. So when I talk about ideology, the definition that I am thinking about most closely mirrors that Robert Higgs gives in his book Crisis in Leviathan when he talks about ideology as kind of a framework or a set of ideas that help people understand and make sense of an infinitely complex world. And so they are things it ideology is a it's a logical set of ideas, but it is not so incredibly logical that it would satisfy the criteria of, say, a logician. So you could think about someone as having like an individualist ideology or a collectivist ideology. But one of the things that is true within this literature on ideology, in addition to not having a definition that we all agree on, is that there is a lot of debate and a lot still unknown about things like how ideology is formed and also how ideology changes. And so, within the context of war and peace, and again, within this kind of broader context of government, tying together Bob Higgs, who I just mentioned, and Bolding, talking about crisis, war, or threat of war as being certainly a potential crisis and what people view as being the appropriate role for government And then also to link back to what we talked about earlier with respect to the taboo line of ideology informing where that taboo line lays and also how that line shifts. And so I think that discussions of ideology are critically important because there is no social scientist on the planet who would tell you that ideology is not important. And yet we have not yet really been able to operationalize ideology. Like we don't have a working kind of economics or like a political economy of ideology. Not to say there's not work out there, but I think that there's a lot to be done. I think, and one of the other things that I mention as a potential research area is that I think any work on ideology is probably necessarily going to have to be interdisciplinary. And I think within the context of this framework that Bolding lays out in Stable Peace, I think that interdisciplinary there is also going to be particularly important.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. And just to make a connection, and we've hinted at this in several places, all you and I haven't talked about it explicitly. Some of the other people I'm speaking with as part of this podcast series, we're focused more on this. But there's a connection here with Kenneth Boulding's earlier book, The Image, which was published in 1956. And there he talks about how one's image, which is their knowledge of the world and their vision of how they fit into the world and interact with others and how they view others, I think is crucial to this point that you're making and serves as another inroad to kind of link up Balding's broader research program with these points you're raising about ideology and future areas for study. So I very much appreciate that. The next one I wanted to ask you about, by one, I mean the next possible area for scholarship and research, is a connection to bottom up piece versus the kind of top down approaches that you and I were just talking about a few moments earlier when we were discussing tensions. And so, can you tell us more about what you mean by these two approaches to peace and any thoughts you might have for future areas of research or extensions?
Sure. So when we talk about kind of these two different conceptualizations of how peaceful relationships are generated and maintained, on the one hand, you have these kind of top down approaches. So those things that Bolding outlines in the second half of Stable Peace in terms of a Department of Peace and the UN and a variety of different programs or kind of international laws that would be set up to establish and maintain peace. That is a very top down approach. And so, in my mind, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is subjected to all of those things that we typically talk about within the context of either central planning or non comprehensive planning. In contrast to that, you have these kind of bottom up ideas of peace where you look at not peace as being something that is imposed, but peace is something that is generated, is a bottom up type of order. And so I think that there are a few different places that we could look at in terms of established scholarship to kind of anchor the way that we might approach this. One is some of the work that you and Nathan Goodman and some other folks have done on polycentric defense. So, this idea that defense is not coming from one place, but it is coming from a variety of different actors. So, I am participating in polycentric defense when I lock my door to the front of my house, and my HOA is also engaged in polycentric defense when we have something like a gate at the entrance to our community. So I think that that is one really fruitful avenue, and I think there's a lot to be done there. The other place that I would look for discussions or as a way to kind of anchor these discussions of bottom up peace is from another Bolding, from Elise Bolding. So this would be Kenneth Bolding's wife. And specifically her book, Cultures of Peace, where she talks about these kind of peaceful relationships that we are existing in and that are being fostered on this kind of like day to day type of basis, which in a lot of literature, I think is fundamentally underappreciated. And I think that that type of work can be potentially very informative. And I think for especially say graduate students who are interested in working on these topics, I think there's a lot there that could be done that frankly just hasn't really been touched yet.
Thank you for that. And by the way, that's a wonderful segue because our discussion now is going to be paired with another podcast that discusses Elise Boulding's Cultures of Peace. So, with the very idea that you just raised, that there's a kind of a tight link, even though the books are written decades apart between Stable Peace and Cultures of Peace. Before we part ways, I want to close with turning to the last page of Stable Peace. So, in the last chapter of Stable Peace is called Research for Peace, and Boulding makes this really interesting point. If you have reactions, that's fine. If not, it's still a good way to close our conversation. But he's talking about the peace research movement. Again, this is the late 70s. He's writing this. But one of the things that's interesting that he points out, and I don't know dollar amounts for magnitudes here, but I do think he's still right from where people tend to shift or place their gaze when they look out at the world. And he's talking about how the tendency is on weapons of war, less so on the factors that generate peace absent resorting to violence. And so here's how Boulding puts it. This is the last page of Stable Peace. One would think that research on how to diminish conflict and release these resources would have a very high priority, but unfortunately, it has not. The peace research movement has always operated on a shoestring and has always been starved for funds. Our motto seems to be millions for the means of destruction, but only pennies for research on how to economize them. It may take a catastrophe to awaken us to our folly. One hopes not, but we must be ready when the opportunity comes. So that's the closing line of Stable Peace. I guess my final question to you, when you think of peace research broadly understood, do you think what Boulding says there still resonates? Do you think things have changed? And hopefully you can give us some closing words of optimism rather than some kind of global catastrophe that he hints at.
I certainly also am in the let us hope it is not a global catastrophe that will finally shift the conversation. I do think that what he says, though, is still accurate in terms of where we tend to see our focus go. I think that there is still this tendency to view mankind as inherently conflictual, which Bowling does acknowledge. Like there is conflict in life and where we can't escape conflict. But that doesn't mean that we can't escape war because war is a subset of that conflict. And so I think there is this historical focus as well as a contemporary focus on, as Boulding mentions, kind of these means of destruction. Because the implicit assumption there, or maybe even explicit assumption, is that we are going to fight. And so I think that here we have an opportunity, and maybe now, kind of just given in the US and elsewhere, the conflicts that are going on throughout the world, whether we're talking about Israel and Hamas or we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, that maybe that now that these things are in kind of the forefront of people's minds again, and we're witnessing really the destructive power of what exactly it is that war does, that people will start to understand that it's not just the avoidance of war that is relevant to study, but also the peaceful relationships that we encounter every day that we don't think about because they seem to be operating really in the background, but moving those from being something we think of as a passive to something that's more active, not only in terms of our own behavior, but also in terms of study.
Yeah, that's great. And in some sense, obviously I completely agree with what you're saying, but that's the source of optimism. One of the things that Balding really highlights, and this comes through in the phase part of it, this comes through in the movement of the taboo line, is creativity on the part of individuals, but also for Kenneth Balding, violence, resorting to violence is a choice, and we always have to remember that. It's an object of choice. It's not something that's innate or an immutable part of nature. And in closing, I'll just highlight on the first page of chapter 4, Policy for Peace and Stable Peace. Balding's going through, a few kind of anecdotal instances where there's been peace in the wake of conflict and stable peace. And he goes on, this is Balding. According to Balding's first law, anything that exists is possible. Benign dynamic processes of this sort referring to those instances of stable peace, Benign dynamic processes of this sort must be possible, and if they are possible, they must be fostered and accelerated by policy, that is, by deliberate decisions which may be designed with a conscious view of society in mind. And from that perspective, it is the ability of us to imagine and envision a future without war and violence that is both motivating in some sense, but also is empirically true. It's empirically true because we know that it has existed in the past, it exists now. And for all the violence in the world, there's also lots of peace in the world too. Abby, any final thoughts or comments before we come to a close?
It's kinda hard to follow up Ken Boulding's own words, but if I have to, then I will say that is something that gives me a lot of optimism, is that we do have every day lots of options in terms of how we choose to approach this kind of ever-present conflict that comes with existence, and something that can really, at least in my mind, it helps me reframe when everything just looks very, very bleak, is to look at all of the instances throughout the day when people do, as you point out, make a choice, and they make a choice to respond peacefully and work collaboratively. And I think that there is the possibility for that. So in that way, I would be an optimist as Boulding is.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for joining us and discussing Kenneth Boulding's Stable Peace today. I hope listeners will check out Boulding's book, but also Abby's paper, In Search of Stable Peace. It's the lead paper in the volume one, issue two of the journal Markets and Society, which is available for free download online if you look up Markets and Society in through the Hayek program. Abby, thank you so much for discussing this with me today. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Jamie Lemke, who is a senior fellow with the FA Hayek program. Jamie, thanks for talking with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time.
We are talking about Elise Boulding's book, Cultures of Peace, The Hidden Side of History. And we're going to dive into some of the key themes, arguments, relevance, both in your own work, but also in the world more broadly, and why this book and the ideas in it matter for those of us who are interested in mainline economics, but more broadly in both understanding the world, but also in thinking about how we can make the world a more peaceful and prosperous place for everyone. And so I thought I'd begin by just saying a few words about Elise Boulding. This podcast is going to be paired with a discussion with Abby Hall on Kenneth Boulding, who's Elise's husband, on his book Stable Peace. And so listeners, depending what order they listen to this, will have some knowledge of Kenneth Boulding, but perhaps not. So I suggest you to listen to that one too if you haven't. But Elise Boulding was a sociologist, and she was born in 1920 in Oslo, Norway, and her family came to the United States when she was 3 and settled, on the East Coast in New Jersey. And like her husband, her future husband, Kenneth Boulding, religion played an enormous role in her life. She was raised Christian, if I remember correctly, and then in her youth converted to the Religious Society of Friends. That influenced her thought on violence, on war, on peace. Of course, World War II and the invasion of Norway also had a big impact on her family and her own thinking as well. But in terms of her studies, in 1940, she earned a BA in English from Rutgers, which is in New Jersey. From there, she met and married Kenneth Boulding around the same time. So in 1941 is when they got married. And then from there, she pursued her master's and PhD, her master's in sociology at Iowa State, and then her PhD in sociology at University of Michigan in 1967. And of course, it's important to mention here that she did all this while also raising 5 children of all different ages in between. And from what we know from Kenneth Boulding, both his own writings, but books written about him, as traditional relationships went at the time, he was out of the house in the office doing his academic work, and Elise was basically bearing the almost entire burden of household work in addition to child rearing as well, in addition to pursuing these degrees. So it truly is amazing from that standpoint when you step back and think about it. In terms of her teaching career then, in her academic career, She taught at the University of Colorado at Boulder from 1967 to 1979, and then at Dartmouth College from 1979 to 1985. In addition to sociology, teaching sociology, she also was crucial in the field of peace studies, in the field of studying the various aspects of peace and violence, and thinking about the various institutions, the formal institutions, but also the informal arrangements that allow people to live together peacefully. And that really sets the stage for the book we're talking about today, Cultures of Peace: The Hidden Side of History, which is one of several books that she published. This one was published in 2000. And I want to start by asking you to talk a little bit about what conception of peace Elise Boulding has and what her purpose is in this book. So the title's The Cultures of Peace, but I'm trying to get a sense of what she's trying to do here and what her conception of peace is all about.
Yeah. First, just a thought on those biographical notes. The time and effort she put into raising her children and all of her own work actually in peace communities. As you said, even from before she was actively involved in sociology as a member of the Quaker Church, which I believe is where her and Kenneth met. We'll get kind of deeper into this, but the fact that she viewed family, church, community, and active engagement as such an important part of building peace, it shows how much she was kind of walking her own talk. And so this wasn't clearly purely wasn't an academic exercise for her, but it actually was something that she truly believed in to the point that she was willing to, really incur the costs because she has this conception of peace. And one of the things that she really makes clear in the beginning of this book in particular is that she strongly rejects the idea that peace is passive. She says pacifism, can be confusing because they have similar roots, but pacifism is not passive. So peace takes a lot of work. And much of that work is a very everyday kind of work. So she puts an enormous amount of activity into this category of kind of peace building type activity. I'll kind of go through and kind of list out a few examples here. But the commonality that holds them all together is they're all activities that are based on mutuality, kind of mutual caring for each other. And so she includes in that raising children, celebrating with other people, giving gifts, participating in processes of exchange. So she has some Smithian discussion of exchange there. So as long as the markets we're participating in are voluntary and we're participating in them freely, that kind of service for mutual benefit she views as kind of a way that we practice mutuality and practice engaging with each other on an equal playing field instead of through relations of domination. And so this cultivation of our ability to be peaceable is something that's actually very familiar to us, and we do it every day. But for a variety of different reasons that I think we'll get into through the conversation, it sometimes gets overlooked and minimized. So I think the overarching purpose of the book is to kind of call out these peaceable activities and to explore what is the human potential to be peaceable with each other and how can this be realized. So there are a couple of really serious challenges that she puts on the table that we can talk about it at this point if you'd like or later. But I think that kind of core piece is core PIECE, the core component of the book is trying to figure out how it is that we can highlight, grow, build patterns of activity around these more mutual, peaceable relations rather than around domination and what she calls more warrior style relation with each other.
Yeah, that's great. A couple of things. First of all, I very much appreciate you raising in your initial comments her role in kind of walking the walk, as you put it. And one thing I didn't mention in my very brief sketch of her life is she was involved in organizations outside of the ivory tower. So she was involved with NGOs, local community groups, and so on. And in her other writings, you see it in this book as well, but in her other writings, you really see this, and she viewed all of that as crucial, and the reason it's crucial, so you have the family component, which you touched upon, but the other thing that really always strikes me with her view of peace is that it's not just a homogeneous thing. It is the first line of the book, the opening very short, I don't know if you call it a preface or the first chapter, but peace, culture, and overview. Her first line is put in the simplest possible terms. A peace culture is a culture that promotes peaceable diversity. And then she goes right into this point you were just highlighting for us. This diversity is all these different, what many people would consider kind of ordinary or mundane things we do are really important. And in the next chapter, she starts by talking about how the emphasis, as you were putting it, is on this warrior mentality, on the rise and fall of empires, on conquest, on deterrence, on weaponry. And obviously, those things are important for both history and life right now. Those things exist, they're relevant, they matter, but it's easy to ignore all this other stuff. I do wanna come back to that issue about challenges that you raised that she puts on the table, but I wanna just ask you a question about another core concept before we get there, just because I think it's important for building on what we're talking about. And we started getting at this, but I just wanna highlight it for our listeners. She employs this term peaceableness in the book, and it's a maybe an awkward term, peaceableness. It's not a word you hear very often, if at all, but there is a purpose that for her invoking that. It wasn't to confuse or to add additional layers. And so can you say a little bit about why she introduces this term and how it kind of fits into what we're talking about?
Yeah, so and she uses the word peaceableness on the first page, and she does offer a really brief definition of it, but I think that definition gets sharpened just through her use of the term over the book. I think the main thing she's trying to add by using peaceableness instead of just peace is that peace can be confused to mean a static state. So just a condition of there not being war or conflict happening at that moment in time. But peaceableness calls our attention to the fact that peace is a process in which the activity of peace building has to continually take place. So, one of the things she talks about in that opener that you mentioned, and she doesn't try to resolve this debate for us, but she points out that humanity contains capacity for great violence, but also for great togetherness and cooperation. And so these capacities are either brought out or minimized by patterns of behavior and patterns of activity. And she says these can show up in every domain of life. So, this idea of peaceableness kind of calls our attention to that process, both the activity of peace building itself, as well as those patterns. She doesn't use the word institutions, at least not much, but it's a very kind of institutional, sociological perspective on these historical cases that she talks about through the book. I'm curious what you think about this kind of analogy, but I kept thinking about how, in order to have a thriving commercial society, a thriving market economy, this requires continuous entrepreneurship and rules to support entrepreneurship. I think it's the same kind of thing here. A thriving, to be in a state of peace, it requires continuous peace building and rules to support peaceableness. It can't just be something static or assumed.
Yeah, I like that very much. In my margin here on that first page where she introduces this, I made a note to myself that it reminded me of Hayek's discussion. This goes to your point about competition. Not that she's invoking Hayek or the idea of competition, more so that, of course, one of the points Hayek emphasized is that competition is a process. Viewing it as some kind of state of affairs, it either exists or doesn't. In Hayek's kind of schema of the world is incomplete, if not wrong-headed. And it's a very similar type conception. The idea that and then one of the things I really like about Elise Boulding's this book, but her work in general, is it sharpens our thinking. It's not right if you internalize her way of thinking to say, like, that society is violent or peaceful, or those people are violent or peaceful, because it's a choice. It can change through time, so there's process. But the other fascinating thing, and this goes back to your first comments about the diversity of peace, is you can have elements of peace and violence at a point in time simultaneously. So you can have a society where there are certain elements of that society that have violent components, but there's many other elements that have peaceful components, and those things can and do coexist. And so, purely from a social scientific, we want to understand the world. Her framework, I think, offers us a deeper way of doing so. But then, from a more practical or policy standpoint, if you want to think about it that way, the issue then becomes, can we leverage those kind of enclaves of peacefulness and scale them up or out? And we can discuss more of that later on. But that's important what you just highlighted, this idea of peacefulness, which is why I wanted to get it on the table for people that haven't read the book.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense based on what she gets into in her analysis that she would want to immediately, on that first page, call our attention away from a static conception, which suggests that peace is something that is given, which puts the responsibility for peace then in the hands of people who give things. Often we might think of major state actors as kind of creating a foundation, but she's immediately trying to pull us away from that conception and highlight the fact that it's a very everyday kind of responsibility that we all participate or don't participate in based on our choices. Moving it out of the static world and into the process world, just like entrepreneurship does when we talk about market competition, it creates that easy entry point where we can understand what our responsibility is. We can start to imagine ways that what we do might change the situation for peace around the world, just like we can imagine how we might impact a market through the different buying and selling or creation invention activities we might engage in.
So let's turn to the analysis then. Part one of the book is the section title is a historical overview. And so she talks about various historical instances of violence, but peace as well. And I want to reiterate, as I set up this question for you, the subtitle of the book. So Cultures of Peace is the main title, the hidden side of history. And I guess the way I'll motivate this question to see what you think is, why hidden? What's the hidden part here? What is she getting at? And why do you think, as you read the book, why do you think she's starting with being backward looking? Why do you think she starts with a historical overview versus then saying, well, here's what we can accomplish in the future, which she does talk about later on, but I wanted to gather your thoughts on that.
One of Elise's very early books was called The Underside of History, which also raises this same idea. And so it's interesting, she's getting involved and other people are, actively creating this field of peace research within sociology around the same time that women's history is becoming a unique field. And within history, there was also more of a movement in the 1960s to do just everyday history, the history of normal people rather than always the history of war and governments and kings. And so the idea that there's a hidden side to history and that who writes the history really shapes what we see from the past is kind of very much coming into consciousness in the 1960s. And her work is a big part of that. So she talks about how, history is something that's written by people. As we know, people are flawed, they have biases, and I don't just mean that they can make errors, but actually part of the job of history, of being a historian or recording a historical event, is to be kind of a filter and to write down what matters most for understanding. So if what you believe matters most are the warrior patterns of behavior in that society, so the conflict and the ability to win conflict, that's what gets recorded. So because Elise Boulding's focus is more on the idea that it's kind of everyday work that happens within families, communities, churches that maintains peace and peaceful culture, there is a connection between the fact that history is so focused on government and military and the fact that we're overlooking the peace side of history. So when historians valorize war, it's not just a problem of modern history. She even talks about how in, mythologies that have been preserved from Greek and Roman times, that these are often tales of war and conquest. But that valorization of war kind of further reinforces for people the belief that war is what matters. And so she points this out as something that makes it harder for us to appreciate the work of building peace. One of the things that I thought was interesting, so kind of the argument that the way we record history matters is not necessarily novel to Elise Boulding, but I think something that's novel in her argument here that is really important to call out is that those history books actually then can shape our future prospects for both militarism, but also for peaceableness. So we might actually need a different kind of history book in order to support a more peaceable society.
That's a great point. We're going to come back to that in a moment because I'm going to ask you about imagination, which is what you're setting us up for in your comment, whether that was your intention or not.
It was a little unintentional, but that's all right. There's creativity, imagination, and play, right?
There you go. But before we move off this, because there's an aspect that you mentioned, but I want to spend a few moments talking about. As she's making her way through this history, one of the things that really stands out to me is she highlights in several of her illustrations, not every single one, but the role of women, women's movements, peace movements, war that were led by women. And I want to ask you a little bit about that and why you think she focused on that. Does it relate to the point you were just making about the underworld? Because I appreciate you bring up that other book, by the way. Is it something else? And so tell us a little bit about that to give the listeners some context to that aspect of the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. She does bring up at several different places in this book the fact that there is a connection, sometimes a comfortable one, sometimes a bit of an uncomfortable one, between the kind of domestic work that has historically been assigned to women and the kind of mutual or nurturing type activity that she thinks is essential for peace building. And I find it interesting that she uses the word nurturing so much because it is one that, especially in English, we associate strongly with women. She she recognizes that historical association, but clearly does not want it to be associated with just women. So she also, one thing I want to say kind of before I go down this road is that she is not necessarily making this argument that we should and she certainly is not making this argument that we should go to more towards a patriarchal traditional kind of practice in order to spend more time on peace building. So she highlights this history of all the work that women have done because often in patriarchal societies, they have been made somewhat of outsiders to public processes. So the fact that they're excluded from many public spaces, from the vote, from holding government positions, from running for elected offices, maybe, at some points in history from being involved in public conversations at all. This has kind of put women in a position to have to find alternative ways to solve problems and alternative ways to advance their goals, including goals related to peace directly. So this is activity that's happening both on the level of needing to develop skills around negotiation, persuasion, the use of rhetoric, crafting a good deal. This is what women who lack formal power have to do in order to accomplish their objectives. And she talks about how they parlay that then into actual organization building. So, one thing I've written about before is women's role in civil society in United States history. She's pointing to that too, and she points it out actually as an international phenomena that women have developed these organizational, persuasive deal-making abilities in part because of their exclusion from public life. So she doesn't view exclusion of women itself as like something that was a good. And the reason why I'm repeating that a little bit maybe is that it is a complicated argument to kind of grapple with because she points out the development of these nurturing and cultivating capabilities as integral for peace, and as something that happened because women were isolated within the home. So historically, it's a complicated situation. And she wants to move towards a future where that is not gender defined. And she is clear to point out that nurturing within the home doesn't need to be the exclusive domain of one gender or another. And she actually makes an argument that if we can step away from strongly enforced separate spheres, then each individual within the family can play to their own strengths in a way that can help further develop nurturing, kind of regardless of who's doing it. Nurturing meaning more broadly just caring for others in the sense of looking for solutions that are going to be good for others as well as just yourself. So it's just that mutual kind of activity as opposed to domination or winning win lose type activity. She wants win win rather than win lose type activity. So yeah, she really highlights that historically women have done a lot of this work and the connection there is a connection, if I can say just one more thing, I know I wanna kinda turn the microphone back to you, but there's potentially then a perverse cycle where if peace building activities are happening within the family and the church and within organizations run by women, in a culture where family, church, and organizations run by women are seen as inferior to more serious organizations like governments and states or maybe universities that are run by men, then peace building also comes to be seen as inferior, less serious work relative to statecraft and war making. And this is despite the fact that this peace building work has historically been critical to human development and has, in many ways, driven the growth of human civilization. Because remember, this mutual work is like market activity. It's growing, it's creation, it's invention. It's kind of all these kinds of mutual nonviolent activities. So it's a really big argument, and one of the things we can maybe talk about later is some of the kind of extensions off of that, but she really is presenting something an idea that's very kind of big and meaty for, for people to be chewing on. So I definitely hope one of the things that'll come out of this podcast is encouraging some more people to pick up this book because it's an idea we really need to grapple with.
Yeah, so much great stuff there, which I appreciate. I have several points I want to just highlight before I move on to the next topic. The other thing that to highlight, I really liked this point you made about when we privilege certain ways of organizing society and what we take as serious and versus what we push to the background or treat as less serious or even naive. You were talking about this in terms of certain institutions in society but also just this is the warrior mentality. When a society adopts that as the serious way to interact with people, that's going to crowd certain things out. One of the things that again, she doesn't talk about explicitly unless I missed it, but I just want to highlight for listeners of this podcast because they tend to be sympathetic, I assume, through selection of high program type arguments. Is the other really important aspect is that these associations, family, women's organizations, male, female, it doesn't matter the gender, they serve as associations which also check government. They provide security, services, protection to members of communities that do not rely on government. So there's a very Tocquevillian aspect to Balding's argument in this book. Although, again, to my memory, I'd have to look back and for specifics, she doesn't make that connection explicit. We mentioned Hayek before with peaceableness. The other note I had made in the margin in her discussion of women is to Julian Simon's Ultimate Resource, where one way to read her argument, again, she doesn't make this connection. This is my reading, is that if we think about if you take her conception of peace and peacefulness as you so nicely laid out for us, if you take that seriously, then every individual is a resource. They're a resource not to be used by others, but a resource of creativity in and of themselves if they have the freedom to flex that creativity because all of us can contribute to peacefulness in different ways. That's the diversity point. And when you exclude certain people, whether it's based on gender, religion, ethnicity, what have you, you necessarily crowd out their creativity and diversity, not just for market entrepreneurship, although that's quite important, not just for political entrepreneurship, although that's important, but just for social flourishing, peacefulness, and so on. I think that's a really important point. She uses the language in here. I was looking back because your comments reminded me of chapter 6 on women and men. She uses this language of partnerships. So that's her view, partnerships between people in society. When men and women are able to partner together rather than one being above, if you will, or privileged above the other, then you really unleash the creativity of human beings to both pursue flourishing lives individually, but also contribute to the community as well. The next chapter, chapter 7, which is the next thing I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts on, she goes even further. She says, okay, men, women, but the other really important aspect of her story is children and young people. And she says, societies tend to view children and young people as like, oh, that's just the silly youth. They don't, what do they know? Kind of thing. We're the adults in the room. And this chapter is called New Partnerships, Children and Adults. And she spends the chapter talking about how children have enormous peace enhancing and peace creating powers. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it's another really important component that then can perhaps lead us. If you have any thoughts on that itself, I want to hear about, but it then perhaps leads us back to conceptions of the family, schools, communities, and so on.
Mhm. By way of a little bit of preface related to a point you'd made earlier about this being true of all kinds of excluded groups, she talks in here about different LGBTQ communities and the way that their outsider role has required them to come up with alternative ways to take care of each other. She talks about peaceful religious movements. Obviously, oppressed groups have had to come up with ways to protect themselves because the state's not always going to do it. The state's often, a driver of racial or religious oppression around the world. She talks about indigenous cultures as groups that often get excluded for reasons of power and warrior dynamics in that society. But through all of these exclusions, you're isolating the ability to incorporate different experiences with the world. And you're cutting yourself off again from all these ideas, this creativity, this way to come up with alternative solutions that don't rely on the good old human go-to of conk 'em over the head and take it if it's something you need. And so the idea that children are also one of these groups, and not every culture, but many cultures have, she suggests, narrow-mindedly cut themselves off from being able to really learn from children. I think that is such an interesting and creative idea. And so she has some criticisms in here of the educational system and of just how much time it takes away from children ever having any kind of interaction with adults or with their broader community. So just the sheer amount of time that children get isolated in these separate spaces. And so one of the challenges she kind of puts out is, are there different ways of education we could think about? And the argument about children and about the family is related to this idea of how much we can learn from a different perspective. So she says children have these very different life experiences than adults do, not just that because they're young and they have the vivacity, the creativity, the lack of, different biases and filters that develop as we move through life, but also they're just a new generation. So it's the fact that they're having a totally different generational experience, and they also have this energy. So being able to kind of interact with children is important for that reason, but it's also just important because we interact with children in a different way than we interact with other adults. So the nurturing that takes place both within the family or, in different roles as teachers or as other responsible adults in children's lives, it keeps us in that mode of trying to build bridges and trying to integrate with other people in a gentle way because it's like these little people that we're trying to teach our social norms and trying to bring into our communities. So just the very fact of interacting with children is a peaceable practice in itself, or at least it should be. I recognize this is a little bit of an idealization because obviously children can be very vulnerable to exploitation, and I'm not denying the reality of child abuse and things like that. So, this is not trying to whitewash over any of that. But, if there are safe ways to bring children more into the community and help them participate in local conflict resolution or in kind of having some of these bigger conversations, it's not just for them as like an educational exercise. It's for us to learn from them also and to learn from that different perspective.
Anyone that's interacted with children knows that, like all of us, they have capabilities in both directions. They can hit each other and take other people's stuff, but they also are extremely creative. They come up with, of course, creative ways of playing and doing things, but also of interacting with other kids, but also just other people in general. And again, so you have another instance where it's another resource, if you will, for society to draw upon. Again, there's a Tocquevillian element to all this. If we take that vision of self-governance seriously, then those skills need to be learned and cultivated. And that both, I would say, in a Tocquevillian sense, but certainly in an Elise Boulding sense. And this goes back to your earlier point about textbooks. That's not like you read a textbook on how to resolve a conflict and then you apply a recipe to it. It's learning through doing, if you will. And it's always struck me as amazing that and important that she emphasizes this role for children throughout the peace process, and how important it is to, as you put it, respectfully integrate them, but nonetheless do so both for their own learning, but also for ours as well. The other really important thing that kids have is imagination. Kids have a amazing ability to imagine the world differently than it is, to go into a headspace that is oftentimes lost as people mature. And I'm not saying we should, in making this transition to my next question, I'm not saying that we should adopt the imagination of a 2-year-old, but on the other hand, maybe so. Look, if you look, and I wanna ask you about the role of imagination, but also your own work, and you've mentioned some of it, and I wanna ask you to say more if you think it relates to what I'm about to set up here. We're gonna try to set up. If you think about major shifts in human civilization, the end of slavery, the inclusion of women and the extension of women's rights, you can think of many more. I'll stop there. At some point in time, someone raised this issue, and if you look at the reaction of them, what was the reaction? That's naive. That's silly. That's ahistorical. This is how it's always been. This is the natural order of things. And why do you wanna, you're acting in a utopian way because you're pretending that that's not nature. And so all of those things were viewed as naive and utopian until they weren't. And that's, in some sense, requires the childish way of thinking about the world, not childish naive, childish in terms of, I have a vision of the world that is so different than the status quo. And people might say that's crazy. People might say that's utopian. But without that, without a vision of the world, you can't move towards a new vision of the world. Again, for people that care about individual freedom, liberty, and peace in general and human flourishing, that's really important because, of course, ideas of individualism, human rights, limited government even, these are all relatively new phenomena in human history. It's the equivalent of like a blink of an eye in human history. And they are all in some sense utopian concepts, but ones that we value. And so to set you up with the question, what's the role of imagination for Elise Boulding? And then how do we think about that? And you can perhaps engage that at a conceptual level, but again, if you have other thoughts from your own work on the extension of women's rights and so on, I'd love to hear that as well, because I think it's a great illustration of this point.
We can't make real what we can't imagine. Imagination is a necessary precursor to any kind of change. And as you pointed out, some of the most radical and important changes that have taken place in civilization, if they don't seem childish, they seem perverse or stupid, sometimes all three. And one of the points Elise Boulding makes is that war can seem inevitable when warrior habits and practices become so much more dominant and common around us than the peaceable alternatives. And so, especially if you are in that kind of context where war feels inevitable, war feels necessary and like something that could never be eliminated, which is, I think, something that many have come to accept. Just like many have come to accept the reality, she points out this strange reality. We have 10,000 societies on the planet governed by 200 states. So we've talked about it a little bit, but I mean, she really hits in this book over and over again this point about diversity and how much more diversity exists in the world than we appreciate. And one of the things that cultivates that diversity and enables us to have such rich diversity as a human species is the fact that we play. This is one of the things that kids are great at is play. As an adult, if you choose to, you can keep that alive. Children can inspire you to do so. You can do it on your own. But children are just naturally good at it. So playing make believe as a kid, as an artist, you play with narratives, you might play with realities, different paradigms. As a scholar in the creative capacity, you play with ideas, with putting ideas in a new context or radically reconceptualizing things that we've come to take for granted. And so play is this domain where we can come to see what isn't already in front of our faces. And this kind of willingness to play and to be creative, to be willing to do something different than it's been done for maybe just a generation, but maybe centuries or at least many decades. It takes some courage. So one of the things that I've talked about in my work on the evolution of women's rights is the courage that it takes to be the first person willing to step into this space that historically has not been yours. By which I mean not been yours, not just in that you weren't offered a formal invitation, but often in many societies around the world, there were laws to keep you out. There were punishments if you tried to enter. And so it takes a lot of courage. You might have to, you know, take some real risks, but at the very least, you have to be willing to look silly. The first woman to go out and wear pants in public. I'm sure people thought that she looked really, really silly. And that might seem a trivial example because that's just about clothing, but it's kind of all these small ways that we're willing to do something different that can add up to actually changing the patterns in a society. So when we've come to accept a warrior type practice of obedience in a particular space. So say we have a cultural norm where wives must always be obedient to their husbands. Every time a couple is willing to negotiate a slightly different arrangement, and men actually have paid a lot of costs in this regard. Women have been primarily the victims of abuse or oppression within the household. Men get a lot of the stigma for kind of changing that paradigm around obedience. So, there's a history of men being mocked for taking on too large of a caretaker role, being seen as less manly, these kind of things. So the willingness to do something different, to not follow the conventions of that society. And I don't say that like it's trivial, like it's an easy thing to do. This is part of what keeps us safe physically, but also in just feeling secure in our lives is that we follow those conventions. Conventions exist for a reason. We act, we know how we at least have a good idea how people are going to respond to us. So when we step outside convention, we necessarily step outside security and safety on some level. So, whether it's transformation in gender norms or transformation in the sense of being willing to engage with each other in peaceable ways in spaces where warrior ways currently dominate, international relations obviously being the huge one. We're having a huge shift towards warrior ways in our immigration policy in recent years. So, I mean, we barely scratched the surface of some of these examples because they're near limitless because kind of to wrap around to where we started a little bit, there's peaceable patterns of behavior and warrior patterns of behavior in every area of life. So there's actually a lot of research and work that needs to be done to figure out how to shift from one to the other if we want to continue to work towards building a society that is based more on peace and mutuality than on war and conflict.
Great stuff, and one point I just wanna highlight because all the points you just raised are excellent, but we're moving towards our end time here, so I wanna make sure we get in the last couple of points I wanted to ask you about. Your comment about the immigration policy is what made me think of this. We've been talking a lot, which is in line with the book, so it's accurate in terms of that. We've been talking about partnerships and relationships within society, but the same logic applies across societies as well. When you it doesn't just have to be men and women in a single society or even gender based. It can just be society based, however, whatever identity markers differ people across or differentiate people across societies was the word I was looking for. If we start viewing the world as us versus them rather than, well, there's us, there's them, and we can live together peacefully, that doesn't mean there's not a conflict of interest. Again, it's not like there's some magical change in human nature. It's how can we resolve those things without resorting to fisticuffs? But once we start setting things up like that, and that it's either zero sum or negative sum, then you can see why violent solutions or threats and force would be elevated as the way you deal with people. They're a threat to us. They're not partners, to use Elise Bowling's term, or they can't be partners. And that leads to a very different way of organizing human relationships. I wanted to, and you touched upon this with some of your examples with immigration, but 25, now almost 26 years ago, this book was published. So I want to ask you to say a bit more, if you're willing, about its ongoing relevance. We've touched upon this, but any specific areas? You mentioned there's some challenges that are raised in the book. If you want to discuss those in terms of both internal to the book itself, but for future research. What we talked about some of your work on women's rights, but you've also recently done some work on women in war. I'd love to hear any tie-in with that. That's certainly, into my way of thinking, an example of the contemporary relevance of the things we've been talking about. But if you were gonna give our listeners a sense of the ongoing relevance of the book, what points might you highlight?
Just briefly, a point about women in war is modern war, which I'm using in a broad sense of the last 100 years worth of conflicts, is different than war historically in the sense that the actual activity of war and domestic activity used to be more separated because men would join the army and they would go to a different place to have a fight. Since World War One, around that time roughly, civilian casualties began to overwhelm actual military casualties, and now they vastly overwhelm. So modern war has kind of gone to the home. So there's kind of a question of whether that enables homes, communities, and churches to still be these spaces where we can continue to cultivate peaceable activity even through wartime, which is what helps prevent the warrior mentality from coming to excessively dominate over the long haul. So I think that that question of how space for peaceable activity can continue to exist given the nature of modern war and the way that it goes into and decimates neighborhoods and residential areas. I think that that's a really important, one of these questions. But another really big question, and this relates to the comment you made about some of the contemporary conversation and rhetoric around conflict and diversity. So, cultural lessons that can help us learn and appreciate the fact that difference is good. Elise Boulding points to as something that could really potentially temper conflict, even on a global scale. So, beliefs that there is a superior culture and a one best way, she highlights as being a driver of conflict. So, I don't know, when my husband uses it when we're having debates at home, I hate the phrase agree to disagree but that's maybe because of a warrior mentality within myself of where I want to win every argument. On a global scale, I think maybe one of the lessons from this book is that agreeing to disagree is not so bad, and we should actually look for ways to do more agreeing to disagree. One of the bodies of theory that she references just briefly, but I think there could be a lot more work done to build it out, is this idea. So she uses the phrase an interconnected localist world of adventurous but peaceful problem solvers. So, an interconnected localist world, and this is something that, again, listeners to this podcast have probably heard this set of ideas before. It's very similar to visions of a lot of other modern liberal theorists like Eleanor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom, who talk about polycentric self governance, like Chandran Kukathas and his discussion of the liberal archipelago. So, I think this could be incorporated into this broader move within liberal theory to try to understand how it is that we can remain interconnected, yet still have spaces to be very different locally. And this helps us kind of not need to fight over every problem. If it's okay and if we can feel safe and secure with other people being different from us, getting to there is part of this creative work that needs to be done. And I know we're having this conversation that has to take place in less than an hour. So some of it might sound a little pie in the sky because we can't get that deep into the details. But being able to tap into the creative potential of local organizations through subsidiarity. So by kind of allowing problems to be solved at the most local level capable of solving them. She gives so many examples in this book, and it's one of the reasons why I think everybody should pick it up. In every chapter, she has like 20, 30 different examples of either peace entrepreneurs or organizations that are working very locally or at the international scale, kind of all across the spectrum, to try to come up with these creative alternatives for how we can work towards peace. So there's a lot of fodder. People could pull out, one or two paragraphs from this book and build a whole case study around it to try to help advance this understanding of how we can use our imagination to transform the warrior way into the peace building way.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I mentioned this earlier, but this is going to be paired with Kenneth Boulding's book Stable Peace. And I also think there's an important connection between the two books, although they're not referenced. They're decades apart in when they were published. But in Kenneth Boulding's book, he talks about things like taboos and the taboo line, beliefs people have, visions they have, the idea of transitions and phases between different states of the world. There can be stable and unstable peace, or stable or unstable violence in his kind of framing of the world. And so from that standpoint, I view these two books as complements. And I think they both remain highly relevant today. And I hope people that are listening to this podcast got a sense of some of the core themes. As you mentioned, we just scratched the surface, but also that they'll consider picking one or both of the books up, reading it both for their own knowledge, but also perhaps for as an input into future research and thinking. Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Always happy to talk about peace.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.